Remember when we thought Black Mesa was as bad as it could get? Well, well, isn't this just like old times?
Half-Life 2 is a very important game to me. I can't even completely fathom how much it meant to my progression as a human being and as an artist. And yet, this isn't even my favorite game of all time, or at all. There's just a certain power that this game holds that I believe is carried out throughout the lives of so many people, not just me. It innovated how people interacted with and perceived video games, and if there's one thing to thank this game, it's that. Pushing forward the industry in a way that hadn't been done before. I find myself so fascinated by the ideas and the universe that is presented in this very franchise that I'll always come back to time and time again and never get tired of. And so, when I saw this clip of a soldier coming down from a ladder to be penetrated through the chest and pulled down by this thing I later came to know as the Hydra, I was instantly intrigued of this, at the time, mysterious version of Half-Life 2. I remember eventually finding out about what the internet called the Half-Life 2 beta, and just being absolutely enthralled of this almost lost document of time where a slew of completely cut ideas were seen for the game. That was 5 years ago, and now I've made it my personal agenda to delve deep into this fascinating look at a Half-Life 2 we never got. Half-Life 2 was going to be dark. Darker than even the product we have now. The original style perfectly represented that unnerving and oppressive feeling that Valve always intended to capture. City 17 was a true dystopia with huge skyscrapers, propaganda posters, and videos everywhere, and it overall had a gritty, gothic, evil, sinister, dirty, and peculiarly green aesthetic to reflect a particular narrative element that itself was cut from the game. Viewing the concept art done by Viktor Antonov, it can be seen that a lot of the design and visual presentation in the beta levels were a lot more faithful to his work. Comparatively, the style here makes the retail product look a lot more chipper and lighthearted. Thank God for Mark Laidlaw's dedication to his work. That statement pertains to many aspects of what he's done for the community and for Half-Life, but in this case, it's how he gave us a look into the world Valve was planning to implement into Half-Life 2. Throughout the development of the game, Laidlaw had written full-size documents of story fragments for designers to refer to that were fortunately featured in the book, and that I actually have, by the way, totally gonna flex that, Half-Life 2, Raising the Bar. Seen in one of these documents was one about the start of the game, aptly titled, Now Arriving, City 17. Laidlaw always intended for G-Man to be the first things players saw in the game, but the details that follow, I would say are pretty interesting. First of all, instead of being set right at the train station in City 17, the player was to be in the Wasteland, which was an area that initially played a way larger role than it did in retail. I mean, in retail, it's basically straight up absent, except for like a split second during the teleportation malfunction sequence at the beginning of the game. I suppose it's a better fate than being completely gone, something that is unfortunately said for a lot of the following things to be talked about here. The player would meet this character called Samuel, who also turns out to be absent in retail, although the aspect of citizens being in the tram with you is not. Hey, buddy. Mister, you can't ride around like that. Where's your mask? Take one step outside without it, you'll be coughing up a bloody foam. It can kill you that fast. Here, look, I've got a spare. Can't be too careful. Samuel makes light of an element that is crucial to the Half-Life 2 beta, which is commonly referred to as the air exchange. This element was the cause of the green aesthetic mentioned earlier. Upon arriving to City 17, the player would see the utter destruction of the Combine and see the metropolis that it was. Here, you would see elements such as the cremator factories, where child workers prepared cremator heads, a part of a cut enemy of the game. The child workers as well were soon to be cut out due to the implementation of the suppression field in the retail product. The Stenographer's Chasm, an adult-driven factory, was an area of the game to be seen in the City 17 section as well. This went on record to be cut out due to it not having any grand impact on gameplay, which honestly is a reason for many of the following things to be canned. Instead of Dr. Breen, there was the console. Besides appearance, voice, and personality, these two essentially played the exact same role. The console actually had voice files where he can be heard spouting propaganda to the residents of City 17.
The true citizen knows that duty is the greatest gift. The true citizen appreciates the comforts of City 17, but uses discretion. The true citizen's identity band is kept clean and visible at all times. The true citizen's job is the opposite of slavery. The true citizen conserves valuable oxygen.
Citizens were seen wearing gas masks to protect themselves from the, Samuel mentioned, deadly air caused by the air exchange. Eventually, the player was to make their way to the Manhack arcade. Here was presented an entertainment area for the citizens, where they would take control of a Manhack via an arcade machine, and were given the goal to kill as many people with it as they could, unknowing to the fact that they were actually doing so, since they were under the pretense that it was all just a game. The player themselves would have actually had the option to take control of a Manhack. Here in this section, the player would meet Barney Calhoun, who would lead you to Kleiner's lab, which notably went through a drastic change to retail. There was even a time where Kleiner was killed in the teleportation malfunction sequence.
Ah, Doc, you poor sap.
The sequential canals were depicted more ruinous to fit into the beta style Valve was going for. Here, the player would meet enemies like head crabs, bull squids, barnacles, etc. And yes, you heard me right. Bull squids were intended to return to Half-Life 2, but obviously did not end up doing so. The player would traverse through this area first on foot, then either on jet ski or airboat, which the jet ski never came to pass in retail, so it ended up being airboat. This area would then make way to the wasteland section of the game. The wasteland was essentially a dried up ocean, caused by the Combine's rule. Many Zen creatures resided in this area, as well as Combine bases for the player to inferably interact with. The main purpose of this level was to demonstrate the overall impact the Combine had on both humanity and otherworldly creatures. The Zen residents in this area were actually seen killing themselves on the border, trying to pass through into the city. This section of the game eventually led to Quarry Town. Quarry Town was just basically Ravenholm, with a few minor changes here and there aesthetically and design-wise, but overall had the exact same premise and, in a lot of cases, design. I suppose Ravenholm could be titled as one of the last true remnants of the Half-Life 2 beta. At the end of this section, the player would have taken control of a digger vehicle to kill a big mama pod in the mines. Besides the mines, everything else was completely cut out. An interesting, or rather unsettling, detail was additionally made in a piece of concept art for the Quarry Town section. In the apartment building, as the player was to traverse up the stairs, on the bottom level, under a bed, a dead child body was to be viewed. Probably cut out due to the suppression field being implemented. Proceeding, the player meets Eli Maxwell, a crazed scientist that hides out and operates in a scrapyard and cave, unlike Black Mesa East in the retail version of Half-Life 2. His relation biologically with Alex Vance was non-existent. Instead, he was a close friend. A cut voice line of Eli Maxwell can be heard, where he warns of a particle storm, another cut concept of the game.
If you've never been out there before, I have one piece of advice. At the first flicker of green light, you run. First storm I saw, I made the mistake of stopping to study it. That's how I lost my leg. I've seen them take out whole squads, reeling in soldiers, tearing gunboats to bits. Some say it's only an electrical disturbance, but if you ask me, there's an intelligence in there somewhere. If only we could communicate with it. A force like that on our side. Now that would be a powerful ally.
Of course, the fate of Eli Maxwell is known. He was merged with the mutually cut character Captain Vance, whom of which was to be a veteran military leader that would help the player during most of the large-scale combat scenarios with his men, the Combine conscripts, and his resistance group. This Captain Vance also is mentioned in a cut voice line by an earlier version of Alex.
I'm hurt. Can't move. Go on without me. Find my father. There's an emergency bunker near the inner gates. He'll be in command there. Tell him I... Run!
After leaving Eli's, the player would traverse through the Antlion Caves, which was just basically recycled in Half-Life 2, Episode 2. This level was to essentially serve as a transition to the depot section of the game. The depot did actually make an appearance in the retail version of Half-Life 2, but only plays a very subtle role, if at all.
Okay, I kind of lied. You do enter the depot in the retail version of Half-Life 2. You meet Eli there, and you teleport there in the Nova Prospect area of the game.
What became of this section would be made into the Nova Prospect area of the retail game. As with many of the previous and following areas mentioned, or to be mentioned in this video, the depot had several different versions of itself as it was moving along in development until its removal from the game, or in the depot's case, complete reutilization. The most notable version was a facility utilized for fueling and switching out vehicles for the Combine. It was placed on a cliff in the desert with a large indoor depot, a small prison near it, a lighthouse that looked over the beach, and train tracks that lied above ground. The player would traverse inside the lighthouse to defeat a gunship at the top of it, making their way inside the facility through the lighthouse basement, and enter the depot through a garage door. It can be seen here that some ideas were recycled for the lighthouse point section of the retail game as well. The air exchange takes place after the depot, and basically you're to stop the Combine's deadly air production in this huge industrialized factory that's heavily guarded by stalkers and other Combine creatures and synths, as well as soldiers. This was a huge level and point of the narrative for the game. It begins with Gordon's train that he got on, presumably at the end of the depot section, crashing into another depot, forcing the player to go to the factory on foot. Before the player reaches the air exchange, you would have met Alex and Captain Vance alongside his conscripts to fight a battle. You would then traverse up to the highest tower in the Airx and battle a gunship to then jump into a pool of some tampered liquid, eventually reaching the main reactor to destroy the factory and air production completely. This would have been the signaling of the uprising instead of Nova Prospect and retail. After the air exchange section, the player would have walked again on foot to the shore, where you would meet a character by the name of Odell, who was to be later recycled as Odessa Cubbage in retail. Odell and the player would travel via a tugboat to a large ship known as the Borealis. The Borealis would be seen drifting along the sea, and upon entering the ship,
many corpses of crewmen would be viewed lying about in its interior. The player would have to fight against many stalkers, soldiers, and zombies to reach the section's end. Tanks containing Combine assassins, a cut enemy that would have served as a successor to the female assassins of Half-Life 1, were to be seen in the ship as well. Eventually, the player and Adele exit the ship with a small submarine that would lead you to Kraken Base. The Borealis was removed and later recycled for Half-Life 2, Episode 2, forever marking itself as one of the most mystical and mysterious elements of the Half-Life universe. Kraken Base was a secret underwater base ran by the Resistance, where the player would have met Elena Mossman, a cut character recycled to be Judith Mossman. It essentially served as a resting point of the game's campaign, where they would be able to interact with objects and characters to cool down a bit. After a while, the ship would have been attacked by the Combine, and the player was forced to proceed further on foot, as the fate of the other characters are unknown at this point of the story. Kraken Base was basically recycled to become Black Mesa East, alongside the mixing in of Eli's Den. This section of the game led to the weather control. The weather control was another area of the game to demonstrate the Combine's impact on Earth's natural life, and the title's sort of self-explanatory. When the player arrives at the weather control, you would have met Alex and Captain Vance once again to fight a very large-scale battle, as detailed in one of Laidlaw's story fragments. During the battle, Captain Vance would inform the player that a cargo plane was to arrive for them and Alex to go back to City 17. Once Alex and the player reached City 17, your plane would crash into a skyscraper, leaving Alex injured and captured by the Combine, as the player is ordered to find her father. The player eventually descends onto the streets of City 17, where they would aid the Resistance in fighting against the Combine, similar in concept to Retail, but way different in execution. During this section of the game, the player was to traverse underground, where they would encounter the Hydra. I believe that the Hydra is one of, if not the coolest thing that was cut from the Half-Life 2 beta. It was a creature unlike anything the player would have seen throughout the game. It was a fast-moving, very versatile, and aggressive enemy, and in general, it just looked really cool. It was described as being made out of luminous gelatinous flesh, where the organs were clearly visible to the player. It would attack using its sharp-ended face and impale enemies, among many other attacks, as that face was actually a part of a larger organism with presumably an even more vast set of abilities. According to its designer Ken Birdwell, it was his pet project, and was something that everyone at Valve got excited about upon viewing its progress. It was worked on for a full 6 months on and off before it was cut. Apparently, it was zero fun to play against in first person, but was amazingly cool to watch it fight other characters. Birdwell left off on the topic stating, "When a design isn't working, it just isn't working." Personally, he wishes it to still exist within the Half-Life universe somewhere, and to possibly have it reworked to act more like an antlion in its AI, or something along that line. Anyways, after that section, the player finally reaches the end and arrives at the Citadel. They would enter through the lower entrance, as illustrated by this piece of concept art, and would make their way up to the consul's office to confront him and save Alex. Here, the player also would have learned that Mossman had betrayed them, as also seen in the final release. A possible concept for the console was that at this section of the game, the player would have viewed that he had gone through the process of becoming immortal through Combine technology, as observed in this piece of concept art. This was actually later reused in a more subtle manner throughout the Half-Life 2 main game and episodes. Overall, this section was rather kept the same, but made changes in effect to other cut elements of the game. Hey, that rhymed. I'm gonna be honest, I missed a few things with this video, such as the vast amount of weapons that you could have got. Some of the cut enemies, such as this weird assassin guy that I completely forgot the name of, as well as the very first map ever developed for Half-Life 2 called Get Your Free TVs! You know, it's kind of impressive how large of a community there is behind the Half-Life 2 beta. There's actually a channel completely dedicated to beta content, mainly Half-Life 2. And those guys over there have done a fantastic job restoring the old Half-Life 2 beta maps to a more playable state. So to those guys, I really, cheers to you with the fucking Diet Pepsi. While I may wish that maybe Valve made Half-Life 2 the way they initially intended it to be, I think that lies more so with the fantasy of it instead of the reality. I mean, Valve knows what they're doing when it comes to making video games, right? And I mean, Half-Life 2 was a really well-received game, so there's really not much to complain about when the product we got in the end was nothing short of great. And while I'm grateful that Half-Life 2 turned out so well, I'll never forget that fantasy. That lasting fantasy of what could have been.